orphan girl left on the trail until the richest cowboy adopted her. The sun was just beginning to rise over the dusty trail, painting the horizon with shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp, and a faint wind carried the smell of dry grass and earth. On this lonely trail walked a small girl, barely 7 years old. Her dress was tattered and worn, and her shoes were full of holes. Her dark hair was tangled and dusty, and her small hands were raw from clutching the straps of a worn-out bag she carried on her back. Her name was Leela, though she had no one left to call her that. Her parents had been gone for days, and now she was alone, wandering through the vast, empty landscape, unsure of where to go or what would happen to her next. The morning was quiet except for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of birds taking flight. Leela's stomach ached with hunger. She had not eaten anything substantial for more than a day. The last time she had food, it had been a small piece of bread her mother had hidden in her bag. Her parents had been poor, struggling to survive in a harsh world, and Leela had often helped them gather small scraps or carry water from the nearby stream. But everything had changed one fateful day when an accident struck her family, leaving her alone in the world. Her mind wandered back to that terrible day, the memory as fresh and sharp as if it had happened only yesterday. They had been traveling along the trail, hoping to reach a nearby town where her father could find work. Her parents had always been kind and loving, doing their best to care for her, even in the face of poverty. But the trail was long and unforgiving, and danger often lurked in the quiet corners of the world. One morning, her father had tripped while crossing a small bridge over a rushing stream, and her mother had rushed to help him. They had both slipped and fallen, and before Leela could even call out, they were gone. She remembered the fear that had gripped her little heart, the desperate scream that tore from her throat, and the silence that followed when she realized they would not rise again. After that day, Leela had wandered aimlessly, sometimes following the trail, sometimes seeking shelter in the shade of trees or under abandoned barns. She learned quickly that the world was not always kind. Travelers passed her by, some noticing her, some ignoring her. Many were cautious or wary, and some even seemed afraid of a small girl walking alone. Leela understood this. She learned to keep her distance, to avoid people who might harm her, and to trust only the occasional kind stranger who offered a small gesture of care. The first few nights after losing her parents had been the hardest. She had curled up under a tree, hugging her knees, shivering as the cold night air wrapped around her. Her tears had flowed freely, and her small voice had whispered to the stars above, asking why her parents had been taken from her. There had been no answer except the quiet rustle of the leaves and the distant howl of a coyote. But even in those dark nights, Leela's spirit refused to break completely. She reminded herself of her parents' teachings, to be brave, to keep moving forward, and to never give up. Those lessons became her lifeline, her reason to continue walking despite the hunger and the fear. By the third day on the trail, Leela's feet were blistered, and her legs ached from exhaustion. Her bag contained only a few items: a small, frayed blanket, a half-eaten piece of bread, and a tiny wooden doll that had once belonged to her mother. The doll had no eyes left, and one of its arms had broken off, but Leela held it tightly as if it were a source of comfort. She often spoke to the doll, imagining that it could answer her, that it could tell her where to go or remind her of her parents' love. It was silly, she knew, but it made the loneliness a little easier to bear. The trail stretched endlessly in both directions, winding through hills, forests, and open fields. Leela had no real plan, only the hope of finding someone who could help her. She drank from a small stream when she could, washing her face in the cold water and letting the refreshing liquid soothe her parched throat. Sometimes she would pick wild berries from bushes, careful to avoid the ones that looked unsafe. It was not much, but it was enough to keep her going for a little while longer. As she walked, She remembered the stories her mother used to tell her at night, stories of brave girls and kind strangers, of magical lands and happy endings. Leela clung to these memories, imagining that maybe, just maybe, her story would also have a happy ending. She dreamed of finding a place where she could belong, where she would be safe, and where she could be loved again. But those thoughts were always tinged with fear, fear that the world might never be kind to her, that she might never find anyone who cared. On the fourth day, Leela came across an abandoned barn at the edge of a small field. It looked old and worn, but it offered shelter from the sun and wind. She cautiously stepped inside, listening for any sounds that might indicate danger. The barn was quiet, the only noise coming from the creaking of the wooden beams and the occasional rustle of a mouse. Leela set down her bag and curled up in a corner, using her frayed blanket to keep warm. That night, she fell asleep with the doll clutched tightly to her chest, dreaming of her parents and hoping that someone, anyone, would find her soon. The days turned into weeks, and Leela continued her journey along the trail. She became adept at avoiding danger, learning to hide from people who seemed unkind, and to approach only those who showed a hint of warmth. She discovered small acts of kindness in unexpected places: a baker who slipped her a loaf of bread, a farmer who let her collect eggs from his chickens, and a kind old woman who gave her a warm cup of milk. These brief encounters were enough to remind her that not everyone in the world was cruel. They gave her hope, tiny sparks that kept her moving forward despite the hardships. Leela also learned to be clever. She remembered every detail of the trail, every landmark, every small town, and every safe place she had visited. She created mental maps, planning where to go next and avoiding areas where she had felt unsafe. She learned to read the signs of nature, the clouds, the wind, the animals, and to use them to her advantage. Even though she was small and young, she began to understand the world in a way that few children ever had to. One afternoon, as Leela rested under a large oak tree, she watched a group of travelers passing by. They were laughing and talking, unaware of her presence. She felt a pang of longing, wishing she could join them, wishing she had someone to laugh and talk with. But she stayed hidden, knowing that she could not trust strangers completely. She was learning the hard lessons of the world, and though it was painful, she knew she had to keep moving to survive. Despite all the challenges, Leela never gave up hope. She believed, deep down, that there was someone out there who would care for her, who would see her not as a burden or a stranger, but as a child who deserved love and safety. She clung to this hope as fiercely as she clutched her doll, and it gave her strength when her body and mind were weary. By the time the sun began to set on the fifth day, Leela had reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. She sat by the water, letting her reflection remind her that she was still alive, still strong and still determined. The trail behind her was long and filled with memories of pain and loss, but the trail ahead, though uncertain, held the promise of something better. She did not know who would come into her life next, but she was ready to face it, ready to survive, and ready to hold on to hope no matter what. And so, on that quiet evening, with the sky painted in shades of orange and gold, Leela settled down by the stream, feeling a small sense of peace for the first time since her parents had passed. She did not know what the future would hold, but she knew she would keep walking, keep hoping, and keep surviving. The trail was long and the world was harsh, but Leela's spirit was unbreakable. She was a little girl alone in a vast world, but her courage, intelligence, and determination shone brighter than any fear or hunger. She was ready for whatever lay ahead, and though she could not see it yet, her journey was only just beginning. Leela continued to walk along the dusty trail, moving slowly but steadily. The days were long, and her small feet were sore and blistered from walking so much, but she refused to stop for too long. Hunger gnawed at her stomach constantly, yet she had learned to survive on scraps of bread she found in abandoned houses, berries she picked from bushes, and water from streams or puddles along the way. Every day was a challenge, and every step felt heavy, but Leela reminded herself that she had to keep moving. Standing still meant danger, and she had already learned that the world could be cruel to those who did not protect themselves. Sometimes she would find a barn or a small cabin to rest in. These temporary shelters became her safe havens for a few hours or a night. She slept curled up on hay, hugging her small doll as tightly as she could. Even though the doll was missing an arm and had no eyes, it represented a connection to her past, a tiny piece of the family she had lost. It gave her comfort, and sometimes she whispered to it, imagining that it was alive, answering her fears and comforting her in return. It was a silly idea, but it helped her feel less alone in a world that seemed so big and empty. One afternoon, as she rested under a tree near a small creek, she noticed a group of boys from a nearby farm approaching. They were older than her and seemed curious. Leela felt a familiar fear rising in her chest. She remembered the people who had laughed at her or tried to hurt her before. She held her doll tightly and stayed very still, hoping they would pass without noticing her. The boys saw her eventually, and for a moment they stopped and laughed at her ragged clothes and small frame. Leela's heart pounded, and she thought of running, but she knew that her shoes could not protect her from the rough terrain, and she would only make herself more visible. She lowered her head, pretending to be nothing, invisible. After a tense moment, the boys walked away, leaving her trembling but unharmed. That experience, like so many before, taught her to be careful, to observe first and act second, and to rely on her wits rather than strength. Not every encounter on the trail was dangerous, though. Leela also met people who showed small but meaningful kindness. A baker in a small town gave her a leftover loaf of bread, and she remembered the warm, sweet smell of it as she held it close and ate in secret behind a stack of barrels. A woman in another village gave her a cup of warm milk, and though it was simple, it felt like a feast after days of barely eating. These small gestures reminded Leela that there was still good in the world, that some people still cared, and that she was not completely alone. She learned to treasure these moments, even though they were fleeting and unpredictable. As the days passed, Leela began to notice details that most people overlooked. She paid attention to the wind, noticing when it changed direction and predicting when rain might fall. She watched the animals, learning which ones could indicate nearby danger and which ones might lead her to water or food. She learned to recognize the sounds of the trail, the creak of wooden doors, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the distant calls of travelers. Each detail became important, a part of her survival toolkit. She became careful and observant, learning quickly to anticipate both opportunities and threats. This awareness kept her alive, though it also made her feel older than her years. Leela also developed a routine that balanced survival with hope. She would wake early each morning and follow the trail, moving quietly and carefully to avoid being noticed by people who might harm her. She would forage for food and water along the way, taking only what she needed and always keeping an eye on the path ahead. At night, she would find a safe place to rest, often talking to her doll and writing little notes in a small notebook she had salvaged from a discarded box. She wrote about the days she had survived, about the people she had met, and about her dreams for the future. The notebook became her secret treasure, a record of her journey and a reminder that she was still strong, still determined, and still capable of hope. Despite her intelligence and careful planning, life on the trail was never easy. Storms would come suddenly, drenching her and forcing her to seek shelter quickly. Sometimes wild animals would appear near her temporary hiding places, making her heart race and her mind fill with fear. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her stomach and slowing her down. And yet, through every challenge, Leela refused to give up. She reminded herself of her parents' words, of the importance of bravery and perseverance. She knew that every step she took brought her closer to safety, even if she did not know where that safety might be. One morning, Leela found herself in a small village at the edge of a wide field. The village seemed quiet, almost empty, but she could smell the faint aroma of baking bread and hear the distant sound of a horse's hooves. She stayed hidden at first, observing the people from a distance, watching how they moved and spoke. She noticed children playing in the streets, laughing and chasing one another, and felt a pang of longing in her heart. She wished she could join them to have friends to feel safe and cared for. But she also remembered the risks, the strangers who might not be kind, and she stayed hidden, content for the moment just to watch and dream. In the village, she encountered an elderly woman who ran a small garden. The woman noticed Leela peeking from behind a fence and called her over gently. Leela hesitated, but something in the woman's kind eyes encouraged her to step forward. The woman offered her a warm piece of bread and some fresh vegetables from her garden. Leela's hands shook as she took them, grateful for the unexpected generosity. They spoke briefly, the woman asking where she came from and Leela answering softly, telling just enough to explain herself without revealing her full vulnerability. The woman nodded and smiled, a gesture that filled Leela's heart with warmth. She knew she could not stay long, but the memory of that kindness lingered, reminding her that hope could be found even in small moments. Leela's intelligence and observation skills continued to grow as she traveled. She began to recognize patterns in the way people acted, learning who might be trustworthy and who might not. She noticed that kindness often came from those who lived simply and had little to offer, while greed and cruelty sometimes came from those who had more but lacked compassion. These lessons were difficult but necessary. They gave her an understanding of the world that most children her age would never experience, and they helped her navigate the challenges she faced on a daily basis. One day, as she followed a narrow path through a field, she saw a family of travelers setting up camp near a creek. They had horses and wagons, and children her own age were playing near the water. Leela watched from a distance, her heart aching with longing. She wanted to be a part of their laughter, to feel the warmth of family again. But she stayed hidden, knowing that approaching strangers could be dangerous. Instead, she observed quietly, learning how they worked together to set up tents, how they cared for their animals, and how they shared food with one another. It was a small lesson in human kindness and cooperation, a glimpse of the life she dreamed of having one day. Despite the hardships, Leela continued to maintain her sense of hope and imagination. She often imagined herself living in a safe home, surrounded by people who loved and cared for her. She pictured herself riding a horse across open fields, reading books by a warm fire, and sharing stories with friends. These daydreams gave her strength, helping her endure the pain and fear of her reality. She knew that one day, somehow, she would find a place where she belonged, and that hope carried her forward along the trail. By the end of the second week on the trail, Leela had grown stronger and wiser. Her body was lean from walking and lack of food, but her mind was sharp, and her heart remained resilient. She had learned the importance of patience, observation, and careful planning. She had learned that kindness could be found in unexpected places, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. Every step she took, every challenge she faced, was a testament to her determination to survive and to her belief that something better awaited her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Leela found a quiet spot near a large oak tree. She sat down and hugged her doll tightly, reflecting on the days she had survived. She thought about the strangers who had been kind, the dangers she had avoided, and the lessons she had learned. She felt a quiet sense of pride in herself, even though she was still lonely and hungry. She had survived on her own for days, navigating a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. and she had done so with courage, intelligence, and hope. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Leela closed her eyes and whispered a small prayer for safety and guidance. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she would continue walking, continuing to survive, and continuing to hope. The trail was long and uncertain, but she was determined to face it with all the strength she could muster. She was no longer just a frightened little girl lost on a path. She was a survivor, a thinker, and a dreamer, ready to face whatever challenges the world might send her way. And so, Leela rested under the oak tree that night, feeling a quiet sense of determination. The trail had tested her, pushed her to her limits, and taught her lessons no classroom could provide. But she had endured, and she knew that her journey was far from over. Somewhere ahead, there was safety, kindness, and perhaps even family waiting for her. She could not see it yet, but she could feel it, a small glimmer of hope that would guide her forward, step by step, toward the life she had always dreamed of. Leela had been walking along the trail for nearly a month now. The days had become longer and the nights colder, but she had learned to adapt. Her small frame was lean, her hands calloused from carrying her bag and gathering food, and her feet toughened from miles of walking. Every step along the dusty paths had taught her something new, which berries were safe to eat, which streams had clean water, and how to stay hidden from strangers who might not be kind. She had survived storms, hunger, and loneliness, but still, her spirit remained unbroken. Somewhere in her heart, she believed that something better awaited her, even if she could not yet see it. One morning, Leela woke to the soft sound of hooves striking the ground. She opened her eyes to see a man on horseback approaching along the trail. He was tall, strong, and well-dressed compared to the other travelers she had seen. His boots were polished, and his hat shaded a serious but kind face. Even from a distance, Leela could sense that he was different. He carried himself with confidence, yet there was a gentleness in his movements, a calmness that made the world seem a little less frightening. Leela felt a mix of fear and curiosity. She had learned to be cautious around strangers. Some had laughed at her, some had ignored her, and some had even tried to hurt her. But there was something about this man that made her hesitate. She crouched behind a bush, holding her doll tightly and watching him carefully. He rode slowly, scanning the trail ahead as if looking for something or someone. As he came closer, Leela noticed that he slowed even more, his eyes darting toward the bushes where she hid. For a moment, her heart pounded in her chest. Would he see her and think she was a burden or worse, a threat? She considered running, but her feet were tired, and she did not want to risk stumbling in front of him. She stayed hidden, hoping he would pass. Instead, the man stopped his horse a few feet away from her hiding spot. He dismounted carefully, tying the reins to a nearby tree. He crouched slightly, speaking softly. "Hello there," he said. "I don't mean to scare you. Are you all right?" Leela's small voice trembled as she answered, I'm fine." She stayed crouched, unwilling to step into the open. The man nodded slowly as if understanding her caution. "I'm Jackson," he said, extending a hand. "I won't hurt you. Are you hungry?" Hunger made Leela hesitate for only a moment before she nodded. Jackson reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small loaf of bread, handing it to her gently. Leela took it with trembling hands, holding it close as if it were a treasure. She took small bites, savoring the warm, soft bread that had been impossible to find on the trail. Jackson watched her quietly, giving her space but remaining close enough to keep her from running. "You've been traveling a long way, haven't you?" he asked. His voice was calm and kind without judgment. Leela hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She did not know if she could trust him, but something in his eyes told her that he meant what he said. I've been walking for a long time," she said softly. "I don't have anywhere to go." Jackson's expression softened and he sat down on a nearby rock. "That sounds very hard," he said. "You're very brave, walking all this way on your own, but it's not safe for a little girl to be out here alone." Leela's lips trembled as she nodded. She had thought of herself as brave, but hearing someone acknowledge it made her feel both proud and sad. I don't have anyone," she whispered. Jackson's heart ached as he listened. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness in her small body, and the fear that she had carried for so long. He wanted to help, to offer her safety, warmth, and food, but he also knew that trust could not be forced. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked gently. "I have a ranch not too far from here. You can rest, have a proper meal, and stay as long as you need." Leela's mind raced. A ranch, a home. She had dreamed of such a place for weeks, but she had also been disappointed too many times before. I don't know," she said cautiously. "I could get lost. I could be in trouble." Jackson smiled softly. "You won't be in trouble. I'll make sure of it. You don't have to decide right now. Come with me just to see the place. You can stay or leave if you want, but I think you'll be safe there." After a long pause, Leela nodded slowly. She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress, and followed him cautiously. Jackson walked beside her, keeping his movements calm and gentle so she would not feel threatened. She noticed the careful way he treated the animals along the way, speaking kindly to the horses and making sure the path was safe. There was a sense of peace about him, a quiet authority that did not demand respect but inspired it. The journey to the ranch took most of the afternoon. Leela walked slowly, her legs aching, but she stayed close to Jackson, feeling a small sense of security she had not experienced in weeks. When they arrived, she could hardly believe her eyes. The ranch was large, with open fields stretching as far as she could see. Horses grazed peacefully, and a few workers moved about, tending to the livestock. There was a big, sturdy house at the center, smoke rising from the chimney, promising warmth and comfort inside. Jackson noticed the wonder in her eyes. "It's safe here," he said. "You can rest, eat, sleep. You won't have to worry about anything for a while." Leela stepped hesitantly into the yard, her eyes wide as she took in everything. She had never seen so many animals or such a large, beautiful house. For a moment, she forgot her hunger, her fear, and her loneliness. She just stood there, feeling a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. Inside the house, Jackson offered her a warm meal. Leela ate slowly, savoring each bite, amazed that there was so much food and that she could eat as much as she wanted. For the first time in weeks, she felt full, warm, and safe. Jackson gave her clean clothes to change into, and as she looked at herself in the mirror, she could hardly recognize the dusty, ragged little girl who had arrived hours before. She felt cared for. She felt human again. Over the next few days, Leela explored the ranch cautiously. She learned to ride a horse slowly, helped feed the animals, and even began to understand the basic work of running such a large property. Jackson gave her space, never forcing her to do anything she did not want to do, but always encouraging her to try new things. Leela began to feel a connection with him, a sense of trust growing each day. She saw that he treated his workers with respect, that he valued honesty and kindness, and that he had a gentle heart beneath his strong, commanding presence. At night, Leela would sit by the fireplace, holding her doll and reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought of her parents, of the trail, of all the nights she had cried alone under the stars. But she also thought of Jackson, of the warmth and safety of the ranch, and of the small hope that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place to belong. One evening, Jackson came to sit beside her by the fire. "You're very brave, Leela," he said softly. "You've been through so much, and yet you've survived. That shows a strength that most people never even know they have." Leela looked down at her doll, then back at him, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. I've only been trying to survive," she said quietly. Jackson shook his head gently. "Surviving is not easy. Most people would have given up long before now. You have courage, determination, and a kind heart. Those are the things that matter most." Leela's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of hope, and of the strange, new feeling of being seen, recognized, and valued. For the first time in her young life, she felt like she could belong somewhere. Over the next weeks, she continued to grow stronger and more confident. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the responsibilities of caring for animals, and the small tasks that kept everything running smoothly. She began to trust Jackson more deeply, sharing her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams. He listened patiently, offering guidance, encouragement, and sometimes just silent understanding. The bond between them grew naturally, based on respect, trust, and care. For Leela, the ranch became a place of safety, learning, and hope. The trail she had wandered for so long became a memory, a story of survival and courage, but not the sum of who she was. She was no longer just a lonely, frightened girl. She was becoming someone who could face the world with strength, intelligence, and confidence. And all of this was possible because someone had seen her, believed in her, and offered her a chance to belong. Days turned into weeks on the ranch, and Leela began to feel something she had not experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. She woke each morning to the soft sounds of horses neighing, chickens clucking, and the wind rustling through the tall grass. The trail she had wandered for so long felt like a distant memory, a chapter in her life that had tested her in ways she could never forget. But the ranch was a place of warmth, safety, and new beginnings. Jackson was always nearby, guiding her gently, teaching her, and letting her explore the world around her at her own pace. The first few days at the ranch had been filled with adjustment. Leela learned to navigate the large fields, to help feed the animals, and to complete small chores around the property. She discovered that working with animals was not only a responsibility, but also a comfort. The horses responded to her gentle touch, and the dogs seemed to sense her quiet heart. She found joy in these small connections, each one reinforcing the feeling that she was no longer alone. Jackson watched her closely, always ready to intervene if necessary, but giving her the freedom to explore and learn. Evenings were the best part of Leela's day. She would sit by the fireplace in the main house, sipping warm milk or eating fresh bread, and slowly began to open up to Jackson. She shared stories of the trail, of the strangers she had met, of the nights she had cried under the stars. Jackson listened with patience and care, never judging her for her fears or mistakes. Instead, he offered guidance and encouragement, helping her to see the strength and courage she had always carried inside her. One afternoon, Jackson brought Leela to the stables to learn how to care for a young horse named Daisy. The horse was timid and nervous, and Leela felt nervous too. She remembered the trail, the fear of unknown animals, and the loneliness she had faced. But Jackson was beside her, showing her how to approach Daisy slowly and speak softly. Leela extended her hand and the horse nuzzled it gently. A smile spread across her face, one that reached her eyes. She felt a surge of pride and connection, a reminder that she could learn, adapt, and care for others, even after all she had endured. Over time, Leela grew more confident in her work. She learned to ride horses across the open fields, feeling the wind in her hair and the freedom of the wide landscape. She helped Jackson with letters and records, demonstrating a sharp mind that had been honed during her days on the trail. She learned to read and write more fluently, using books from Jackson's library, and she discovered a love for stories and knowledge that had been kept alive during her lonely nights. The bond between Jackson and Leela deepened with each passing day. He became more than a protector or teacher. He became a true father figure. He celebrated her successes, encouraged her curiosity, and reassured her when doubts or fears crept into her mind. Leila, in turn, learned to trust him fully. She no longer had to hide or be constantly alert. She could relax, laugh, and even play without fear. The laughter she had longed for on the trail now filled the ranch, mixing with the sounds of the animals and the rustling trees. One day, Jackson approached Leela with a serious expression. She noticed it immediately, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Layla," he said softly, "I've been thinking. You've been here for a while now, and I see how brave, kind, and intelligent you are. I would like you to stay here for good. I want to adopt you as my daughter if you're willing." Leela's eyes widened, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and hope. She had dreamed of a family, of someone who would care for her, but she had never imagined it would be real. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, You want me to stay? Really?" Jackson nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, Leela, you've already become part of this family. I want you to have a home, a place where you are safe, loved, and valued. You don't have to worry about the trail or being alone anymore." Leela could hardly speak. She had waited so long for safety and love that she felt it all at once, overwhelming and beautiful. She ran to Jackson and hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth and security she had been missing her whole life. In that embrace, she knew that the long journey on the trail was finally over. She had found someone who would care for her, protect her, and guide her through life. The days that followed were filled with preparations for her new life. Jackson helped her understand what it meant to be part of a family, teaching her about responsibility, care, and love. Leela learned that family was not just about blood, but about trust, respect, and shared experiences. She helped with chores, spent time with the animals, and continued her lessons, all while feeling the comfort of a home where she belonged. Leela also formed friendships with the workers' children on the ranch. At first, she was shy and unsure how to interact with them. She had spent so much time alone that socializing felt unfamiliar. But the children welcomed her, curious about the little girl who had survived so much on the trail. They laughed together, played games, and shared stories. Leela discovered that friendship could be fun and safe, a stark contrast to the loneliness and caution that had defined her early life. Jackson continued to guide Leela with patience and understanding. He never forced her to do anything she was not ready for, but he encouraged her to try new experiences. He celebrated her achievements, whether learning a new skill, completing a task on the ranch, or mastering a new lesson. Leela felt a growing sense of pride in herself and her abilities. She realized that she was capable of much more than she had ever imagined during her lonely days on the trail. One evening, as the sun set over the wide fields, Leela sat with Jackson on the porch of the main house. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds returning to their nests. Leela looked out over the ranch, feeling a deep sense of peace and gratitude. She remembered the trail, the hardships she had faced, and the fear that had once consumed her. And yet, here she was, safe and loved, with a family and a home she could call her own. "I never thought I would find a place like this," she said softly. Jackson smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You deserved it all along, Leela," he replied. "You've been through so much, and your courage, kindness, and determination have brought you here. This is just the beginning of your new life." Leela felt a surge of hope and excitement. She knew that challenges might still come her way, but she also knew that she would no longer face them alone. She had Jackson, the ranch, and a community of people who cared for her. She had a home, a family, and a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. In the months that followed, Leela continued to thrive. She learned more about caring for animals, managing the ranch, and reading and writing. She explored the fields, climbed trees, and ran with the other children, feeling a freedom and joy she had never known. She also learned about kindness, compassion, and responsibility, values that Jackson taught through example. The ranch became a place of growth and discovery for Leela. She began to dream not only of surviving but of contributing, of helping others, and of making a difference. Her experiences on the trail had shaped her into a resilient, thoughtful, and empathetic young girl. Now, with the support of her new family, she could transform those experiences into strength and wisdom. As the seasons changed, Leela's bond with Jackson grew even stronger. He became not just a guardian but a mentor, a friend, and a source of unwavering support. Leela learned to trust completely, to love without fear, and to believe in herself. The fear and loneliness that had defined her early life were replaced with confidence, joy, and a sense of belonging. One bright morning, Leela rode Daisy across the open fields, feeling the wind against her face and the sun on her skin. She thought about how far she had come, from a frightened girl alone on a trail to a confident, happy child with a loving family and a beautiful home. She realized that the hardships she had faced had made her strong, and the kindness she had received had taught her to hope again. Jackson watched her from the porch, a smile of pride and love on his face. He knew that Leela had been through more than most children could imagine, yet she had emerged with courage, intelligence, and a gentle heart. She was a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, hope, kindness, and love could change a life forever. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch and the sky glowed with colors of gold and crimson, Leela sat beside Jackson, holding her doll and feeling a deep sense of peace. She had a home now, a family who cared for her, and a life filled with possibilities. The trail she had once walked alone, full of fear and uncertainty, was behind her. Ahead lay a future filled with love, security, and endless opportunities to grow, learn, and dream. For Leela, the journey had been long and difficult, but it had led her to a place she had always longed for. She had survived hunger, fear, and loneliness, and in doing so, had discovered the strength and resilience that would carry her through the rest of her life. Now she could finally rest, knowing that she was safe, loved, and truly at home.